Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Brent Nicola from the Office of Alumni Relations here at UM-Flint. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're excited to host the first event of its type for us, a sort of a live talk show style event. You know, we moved a lot of our events online with the start of the pandemic. I've been sort of crossing off the days just about 2 weeks shy of a year ago. For all of our events essentially have gone virtual, and we expect to be virtual for another 6 months or so. We'll see kind of what's going to happen here in the fall. I know that the university is planning. We had the chancellor on for a town hall just last Wednesday, and the goal is to be back face to face come this fall. So hopefully, I know we in the alumni office, our business is, I joke about handshakes and hugs is what our business is about. And I can't wait to get back in a position where we can see everyone and talk to everyone face to face for some of our events. I'm hopeful that those things are just around the corner. We have discovered some great things in the process of being virtual. We've been engaging with alumni all across the country, and in some cases, for some of our events, all around the world. And so we've tried to make lemonade out of lemons, if you will. With the pandemic, and it's been quite an experience in doing it. So, thanks again for all of you that are joining us. This evening is going to be about parenting and about the sort of the effect that the pandemic has had on us. I think back to when we went virtual as a campus nearly a year ago, and it was interesting as we very quickly were trying to understand and come up with what are the things that we could communicate with our alumni about that were relevant in this period. We were all digesting daily updates. Things were changing on a daily basis as a campus, in the news, you name it. It was that as we are all like, what is this new normal? How we were parenting, how we are parenting was one of the key things that came up. We worked at the time with the School of Education and Human Services, and I worked with several faculty members to generate some content to push out to alumni to say, hey, these are the things to consider as we're heading into that into this period of unknown parenting territory. And it's really kind of, in some ways, it's really I don't know, it's almost prophetic that we are coming back a year later, almost to the date, to talk about how that has changed and what's happened in that year in the area of parenting. So I want to introduce, and I'm going to step back, Mary Jo and I want to recognize Mary Jo, who's here this evening as well. Mary Jo and I together would like to introduce Tynee Sims, one of our fellow alums from 2007. Tynee, after graduating with a healthcare administration degree at U of M-Flint, went on to Grand Valley State for a master's in communication, which she certainly has put to work in her career. First starting as an intern at WDZZ 92.7. I remember listening to that as a teenager here living in the Flint area, and then also working at the school. Apparently, I'm not sure I think worked at the school paper, is it? And then also on Fox 17 did some television work as well in her time. She had a show that was called Good Health that was on Flint Club 93.7 for a bit as well. Later, after her mother's death, Tynee moved to Dallas, Texas, where she now works at the Dallas College Northlake campus as a program services coordinator for TRIO student support. So something many of us at U of M-Flint are familiar with the TRIO program, and our friends over at Mott Community College are. In fact, one of our alums ran that program, Clarence Jennings, CJ, ran that program for many, many years. So Tynee, thank you for being here, and everybody welcome to Tynee Talks Live.
Yo, it's Tynee Talks. Talk about it right here. Yeah. You ready? It's Tynee Talks right here. We gon' talk about it right here. We gon' talk about everything you like. I'ma make it real, real clear. It's Tynee Talks right here. We gon' talk about it right here. I'ma talk about everything you like. I'ma make it real, real clear. Cause it's Tynee Talks. And I'ma talk about it. Yeah, cause it's Tynee Talks. And I'ma talk about it.
Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to the Tynee Talks live virtual event in conjunction with the University of Michigan-Flint. Go Blue, my alma mater. I'm so excited to be joining you guys virtually. Hey, Ashley, I see you in the chat. It's such a pleasure. And today we're going to be talking about parenting in a pandemic. What has it taught us? And if you're a parent in the audience, if you're on your computer or on your phone, there's a icon for you to raise your hand. So I want this to be interactive so that if there's a point where I ask a question or want some feedback, go ahead and use the raise your hand icon. So with that being said, how many people in the audience are actually parents? Go ahead and click the raise your hand icon and we can see where we are at with the parents. So I will be interviewing the renowned author, Mr. Alfie Kohn. And I want to just tell you guys a little bit how I got into Alfie Kohn. So I'm a parent, obviously. And we were just trying to think of different ways to parent, discipline and all that. And we did everything. We prayed, we cried, we did a lot of things. And we just was like, we can't do it alone. So we end up coming across this book and we learned a lot. And we came across it at the beginning of the pandemic, and it really shifted our way of parenting throughout the pandemic, and it helped us a lot. So hopefully some of the knowledge that we share with you guys can help you on your parenting journey. So Mr. Alfie Kohn writes and speaks widely on human behavior, education, and parenting. The most recent of his 14 books are Schooling Beyond Measure and other unorthodox essays about education. The Myth of the Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom About Children and Parenting. And of his earlier titles, the best known are Punished by Rewards, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, and what we'll be focused on today, Unconditional Parenting. Mr. Kohn is the father of 2 grown children, and he lives in the Boston, Massachusetts area. So without further ado, welcome Mr. Alfie Kohn. Welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. When I, kind of talked about parenting on my podcast, I wanted you. I was like, I got to meet this man who has just transformed our parenting life, right? And so parenting can be a challenge. As we like to say in my household, parenting is a revolutionary act. The term revolutionary refers to something that has a major, sudden impact on society or some aspect of human endeavor, and how we raise our children impact our society. So that's very important. So Mr. Kohn, I have a quote, right, in my email signature. And that quote says, the most dangerous phrase in the English language is that we've always done it that way. And you kind of touch on that phrase, so to speak, in your book, when we talk about parenting and how people parent the way they do, which if you ask them why they did what they did, it was always done that way. Can you expound a little bit more on that concept?
Yeah, I call it, how did my mom get in my larynx? When,
Yes.
we find ourselves using the same words and phrases, sometimes in the same tone of voice. But if you point out to folks that there may be better ways to raise our kids, the implication is very unsettling, even terrifying to people, because it makes them question or invites them to question the way that they were raised. So if somebody says, that's the way I was raised, as if that closes the discussion, whereas it should open the conversation so that we have the gumption to ask, does that make sense? What from our childhoods do we find valuable and want to continue into the next generation, and what would we rather leave behind? So in my books about parenting as well as education, I'm interested in asking not the little bitty questions like what's the best way to get your kid to clean up his room, but the much larger, radical, if you like, revolutionary questions, which is to question the whole premise here. Like, why should my kid have to keep his or her room up to my standards if it's the only place on the planet that belongs to the child? You know, in fact, one of the things about parenting well that requires not only care and talent and time, but also courage is our being willing to realize that when our kids don't do what we told them to do, the problem may be with what we've told them to do, not with the child. And the solution is for us to rethink our request rather than to look for a new technique to get mindless obedience.
Oh, I love that. You're right. And that's one of the my areas of growth, right? When you talk about the room. I literally said that to my son, AJ. Everyone knows my son, AJ. I literally said that the other day. I was like, clean your room and don't do it your clean way. Do it my way. Because we know that there's, there's a difference. So I know that's my area of growth, but you're right. It should open the conversation. And what happens is when we shift or change how people view, we should, raise our kids or discipline our kids. What you mentioned in the book is that, you might get dirty looks, right? So if they say, let's just say your kid was acting a plum fool in the store, right? And in my community where I was raised, it's like, whoop that kid to get them straightened out. But if you change that way you are and you just kind of talk to them kindly, or maybe, I don't even say negotiate, but you just do it a different way than what is done. And that could be anything, right? When I was growing up, my mom let me and my sister voice our opinions. Basically what she did is we could always ask why. If my mom said we're not doing something or we are doing something, we could say why. People would look at my mom crazy. So it's basically like she knew you wrote this book before you wrote this book.
I don't pretend to be the first person to say treat children with respect, which is what your mother was doing, basically.
Absolutely.
So when I do a presentation workshop for parents, or when I used to do those, when that was a thing, before we were all under house arrest, I would ask people at the beginning, what are your long-term goals for your children? How would you like them to turn out after they've grown up and who knows, maybe even moved out? And everywhere I go, white, black, Asian, Latino, urban, suburban, rural, and out of the US, other countries, I get the same basic answers over and over again, where people say, I want my kid to be safe, to be happy, to be ethical, to be caring and compassionate, but also independent and self-reliant, to be curious, creative, successful problem solver. These are the terms that always come up. And so what I do for a living with education, not only with parenting, is basically to say to people, you say you want this, so why are you doing that? And here's what the research says about a lot of that. What I call a doing to approach to parenting, which is usually some variation of threats and bribes, punishment and reward,
yes,
can never help kids to become all of the things that I just listed that people themselves say they wanted. I mean, it doesn't matter if I have doubts about your parenting. Who cares what I think, What matters is that your own objectives in long term for your children are put at risk as a result of conventional, traditional, doing to, top-down, power-based practices. And that means moving toward a working with approach in which we do a lot more asking than telling. We would never dream of using physical violence on children, which mostly perpetuates violence and depression, according to decades of research. Doesn't keep kids safe. And in tough neighborhoods where it's really important that kids be kept safe, and spanking them or hitting them puts them more at risk because you're teaching them to mindlessly defer to people who have more power than they do. And that won't always be you. In fact, other kinds of punishment, including forcibly isolating young children, which we like to call timeout, because that sounds a hell of a lot better than forcible isolation,
Right.
or taking away privileges, also teaches power and mindless obedience. And it also teaches kids, what do they want me to do? And what happens to me if I don't do it? So this is not, no punishment, or even if you call it a consequence, has ever helped a kid to become ethical or be concerned about other people's well-being. It's all about power, obedience, and what can I get away with this without being caught? And then the flip side, which could occupy us in itself for an hour, is rewards, including verbal rewards. Good job. Stickers.
I want to chime in right there, Mr. Kohn,
Sorry.
because you touched on a really good, and we're going to get into, so Mr. Kohn is basically talking about punishment reward. That's chapter 4 of his book, Punitive Damages, right? And he's going to get into the reward part. But that's how I came to your book. We were basically doing that with my son, right? We had a coin system. We were just trying all these different ways to get him to act, right, a certain way without partnering with him, working with him, trying to get an understanding of him. And that's basically what happened during this whole pandemic. I don't know if any parents out there can relate, that you learned not only a lot about your children during this pandemic, but you learned a lot about yourself. So in chapter 4, you talk about the corporal punishment, and you just touched on it. Corporal punishment, that is spanking, hitting, slapping, what those things do, and Mr. Kohn did the research, it just makes those children more aggressive. And it goes back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation. A lot of people will say, well, I was hit, or I was whooped, or I was spanked, and it made me better. It made me a stronger person, but you're not looking at the other things that it did to you as a person. Maybe you don't want to dig that deep. Maybe you haven't even thought about it, but take a moment to reflect on that. So the lesson in this is that you can get, what children take from that is that you can get what you want by hurting people weaker than you. So if any of you have a child that's a bully, they could have learned that bullying behavior from you because you are the stronger person. And words are powerful and words are important, Mr. Kohn. You said using violence against a child. When we say violence, it stings more than I whoop them or I spank them. It stings more. So when we put words into context, you're using violence against a child that cannot stand up to you. And that is something that we definitely learned in this pandemic, along with what you were going to say about timeout. You used a concept or a word called love withdrawal. And we don't just do it with our kids, guys. We do it with our spouses. We do it with our homegirls, our friends. If someone doesn't do what we like, we may not hug them, or we might not kiss them, or, you know, we see it on TV shows all the time, right? Go sleep on the couch, right? You did something to me, go sleep on the couch. That kid did something, you know, go to timeout. That's love withdrawal. You withdrawing your love from them. And therefore you're placing, as his book says, unconditional parenting, you're placing a condition on whether you're gonna love this child or show affection to this child. So those are some things that definitely learned during this moment in this pandemic. So did you want to expound on that?
Sure, you've done a good job of summarizing some of what I have said and might say. I guess to back up a step though, the unconditionality, which is why the word unconditional is in the title here, is something that not everybody thinks about as important, because kids don't just need to be loved or even loved a lot. They need us to love them no matter what. That's what it means to love unconditionally, to love them for who they are, never for them to come to believe that their behavior determines whether we love them, so that we would shut it off like we're turning off a faucet. Even when they screw up, even when they fall short, they need to know that our care for them has never been dimmed. It doesn't mean we can't and shouldn't work through and discuss what's problematic that they may have done, why they did it, what could be done instead. But it means that they should never experience us pulling away, which is exactly what timeout does, where we literally physically distance ourselves from them, let alone using violence on them, which is a clear way of saying they have to earn our affection and attention and acknowledgement. And a lot of research in psychology finds that conditional love, as the child experiences it, which is what matters, not whether we think we love them unconditionally, but whether they are led to perceive it that way, that when kids feel like my mom or dad loves me a lot more when I am well behaved, when I do well in school or in sports, when I don't embarrass them in front of their friends, when I hide my negative emotions, whatever it is, whenever there's a strings attached to the love as they see it, that gets in the way of healthy growth. And it leads them to internalize that sense of, I'm only a good person when I'm quiet, deferential, smart, funny, pretty, whatever it is. And so this is a book about how to help kids become what we hope they will become in the long run. All those things I mentioned before: safe, happy, ethical, caring, independent, by making sure, above all, that they experience our love for them as absolutely unconditional. And that in turn requires us to work with them to solve problems, not to do things to them to make them obey us. And you said something, Tynee, a moment ago that I just want to pull out. You were talking about with AJ, I think, the idea that you wanted a particular action from him, and that you fell into the trap or felt yourself tempted to fall into the trap of, punishing or demanding or rewarding, with attention. But part of the problem isn't just the method, using rewards or punishments, using conditional affection. It's also the focus on how he's acting, on the behavior. Because ultimately what matters much more than behavior are a kid's reasons and motives and values for engaging in the behavior. That's why I worry whenever I come across a book or a webinar, seminar about parenting or education that uses the word behavior too much. That means we're trapped at the surface, the stuff you can see and measure, and we're losing the child who engages in the behavior. When you open that, you not only look into the future to look at long-term stuff, not just short-term, how can I get them to do this now? But you look vertically, so to speak, below the behavior. You end up discarding punishments and rewards and doing stuff that's not only more respectful and responsive, but also a lot more effective.
Absolutely. Wow, you guys, you see why Alfie is the man? You see why he's here? So another thing that you touched on in the book, and a lot of people can relate in the pandemic, right? School changed. Mm-hmm. And prior to the pandemic, everything was like academic based. My kid has to get the best grades. My kid has to get an A. My kid has to be the top student. And what this book teaches us is that the whole idea of my child has to get this A, they're not learning. And you said something about the grading system kind of kills curiosity, right? If the child is only focused on getting an A or passing, they might not see the beauty or actually learn the things that are in front of them or the things that are in that book. And so that was one of the things that even helped me so much. Now, when AJ gets out of school, or I ask them, what did you learn today? And I want you to teach me what you learned. And now I've taken that off the table. He's always gotten good grades, but there was a moment in the pandemic, right, where his grades kind of faltered, and that could have been a lot of things. And I was actually focused on that, but reading further into the book, it's more so I asked him, did you learn anything? I don't care if you didn't do so well. What did you learn? And I think that is a key point that we needed to learn in this pandemic, because we learned like standardized tests won't save us in a pandemic, right? You need the thinkers of the world to save us, the scientists, the explorers, the people who are going to try new things and concepts. Can you expound on that?
Yes, and for those people watching us now who are interested, I've written a whole bunch of books and articles which are free on my website, which is just my name, alfiekohn.org, that there's articles just about grades. There's a book just about standardized testing. There's books about other aspects of education. But if rewards and punishments are not just ineffective for parents, they're actively destructive, which is what I would strongly argue based on research, that is just as true in school, and grades are a great example of rewards and punishments. The reward is the good grade, the punishment is the bad grade, and so on. And sadly, there are actually parents who will give kids some treat, some toy, money, whatever, for getting a good report card, which is a reward for the reward. You can almost watch the kid's interest in learning evaporate before your eyes. And that's just as bad as the flip side of that, which is punishing kids for getting bad grades, which is a punishment for a punishment. So the research on grades, and let me be clear, the problem here is not just the attitude of the student or the parent. The problem is the practice of giving grades, which is why the best schools in this country never use letters or numbers to rate, let alone rank children against each other, because they know the research. They find more informative and less destructive ways of communicating to kids and their parents about what's going on, how they're doing, where they need help. So the research finds that if you are comparing kids who get grades, or especially those who are under a lot of pressure to get good grades, with kids lucky enough to be in classrooms in schools where there are no grades, you find three basic differences. The kids who are led to try to get better grades, first of all, are less interested in learning than kids who are not given grades at all. Every study I know that has looked at motivation to learn in a graded versus ungraded group has found that grades are destructive to that motivation to learn, that curiosity. Second, kids who are trying to get good grades, bring home a good report card, will, if given a choice, tend to pick the easiest possible task, the shortest book, the easiest project. And it's not because the kid doesn't have a growth mindset. It's not because the kid is lazy or needs an attitude adjustment. The kid is reacting rationally to an irrational system because, as the kid will say to you, duh, the chance of my giving you what you seem to care about, an A, is a lot higher if I do something easy. So every time you tell me you want to see a good grade here, you know, you're saying to me, don't take any intellectual risks, cut corners. And the third effect, according to the research, is that kids trying to get good grades tend to think in a shallower way. They're less likely to ask, yeah, but how do we know that's true? Or, yeah, but doesn't that kind of contradict what we were talking about last week when you said, and they're much more likely to ask questions like, do we have to know this? Is this going to be on the test? Right? So if you want kids who love learning and fall in love with playing with words and numbers and ideas, and you want kids who stretch themselves and want to do challenging stuff, and you want kids who think deeply, you would never say, I want to see an A in here. You would be marching your butt into the teacher's room, when that's possible again, hopefully with a bunch of other parents, to say, here's the research. How do we turn this into a school that's about learning by not having grades?
My gosh, I love how you are using like those buzzwords like growth mindset, right? We always want to use these buzzwords to show how smart
that blames the kid. When you use growth mindset, when you talk about mindfulness or self-control, self-discipline, these are all ways of saying the problem's in the kid's head. Don't ask us adults to change what we're doing. We need to train you to have a better attitude or orientation.
You're absolutely right. And just along those lines, when you're talking about the grades, one of the things that we've learned in this pandemic is that, and I think you've written books and articles on this, that we don't need homework. I think that we were stressing our children out. Like now my son doesn't have homework. It's school and then his school is over. And we just need to get rid of it. And like you said, it kills the curiosity. Now in our society, like we're pushing STEM, right? STEM is the big thing. The that we're trying to push children in. But as you said, we've killed our scientists, because a scientist will have a hypothesis, right? And they'll question something, and they'll just keep doing trial and error till they get to the answer that they're trying to get. But we stifle that with our children. We're just telling them to shoot for this A, like you said. I'm an educator, and my spouse is an educator, and it sickens and saddens him that all the children want to know is, if I do this, will I get a point?
Right, and don't blame the kids for that, you know.
Yeah.
Don't blame kids.
The school, it's the school system. Yeah.
That's right. And we need to exert pressure from a more progressive direction to push back against the mindless traditionalists. You mentioned before, you know, how a lot of people just say, this is the way I was raised, you know, I got hit upside the head with if I back talked. It's good. It was bad enough for me. It's bad enough for my child is basically the, you know. You see, it obviously worked with me. I grew up to be the kind of person who hits my child. That's how successful it was with me. And by the way, I want to recommend a book here that I didn't write on this by a Black woman named Stacey Patton, who called Spare the Kids. And it's specifically about the destructive effect of physical violence as discipline in the African American community in a historical perspective. It's a good book. But when you start talking about the school, you're talking about the same kind of, well, that's the way I was raised, with spelling bees, awards assemblies that pitted us against each other. So other people had to fail for me to succeed. I was raised with grades and homework, about which I've written a whole other book, by the way. And I was raised passively listening to lectures and being punished and rewarded for my good behavior, which means mindless obedience, you know. And the reality is that not all of us have come out so well in terms of having that scientific curiosity and willingness to persevere that you mentioned. You know, not many of us in this country do love to read for pleasure. A lot of us do want to know, yeah, but what are you going to give me for it? These are exactly the kind of things you would expect from traditional parenting and traditional education. And for those of us who did come out with our curiosity intact, with our compassion for other people, and so on, I would argue that it's in spite of traditional parenting and teaching, not because of it.
Yeah, you mentioned Stacey Patton, and we just learned about her literally like 3 days ago.
Oh.
I literally just learned. So I'm like, wow, he said Stacey, and we wanted to get her book. So that's awesome. But you talked about competitiveness, and that's something that we've learned in this pandemic, that there's no need to be in a pandemic. I mean, a pandemic. A competition, because as you said at the top of this conversation, what do people want from their kids? They want their kids to be successful, calm, kind, all these good attributes. But when you add competition in there, it kind of pits you against your fellow man, right? You're pitted against that kid in ballet class. Or we get like a Nancy Kerrigan situation. Remember that from the 90s, where she beat her in the knee so that she couldn't ice skate well?
Yes, I remember that. You know what's worse than a reward is an award. You see the difference? An award is a reward that everybody can't get, because if I get it, you can't, and vice versa. So it's bad enough to rate kids by giving them letters or numbers. Far worse is to rank them against one another by either grading on a curve or the way they do in some of the worst high schools, which is to say the most traditional high schools, to have a valedictorian class rank and so on, to have teachers who are pitting kids against each other and having a contest. It's bad enough for me to be led to treat what I'm doing, the learning, as just a means to an end of getting a good job, or getting a sticker, or getting a gold star, or getting an A, or whatever. That's bad enough. But if you really want to poison kids, you don't just lead them to think about what reward I'm going to get. You lead them to think everybody else is an obstacle to my success, and I have to overcome them. Now, aggression, bullying, cheating, all of that become reasonable, rational responses to a broken system, because the adults have led kids to believe the goal not only isn't to love learning, the goal isn't even excellence. Now the goal is victory. And I can't put this too strongly. Winning and succeeding are two completely different things. And contrary to what most of us have been brainwashed to believe in this country, where competition is our state religion, the more you get kids focused on winning, the more it undermines the quality of their learning and performance. And that blew my mind when I saw the research on that many years ago. Study after study after study shows that competition actually holds people back from doing their best. Kids and adults, men and women, boys and girls, and across cultures.
I can definitely see that, because when it shows up in your adult life, you may be scared to share an idea because you don't want someone to steal it, or you don't want someone to take credit for it. That could actually be a benefit, to the whole.
Oh, in a well-functioning environment, whether we're talking about a classroom, a workplace, or a whole society, you succeeding helps me to succeed, and vice versa, because the whole task has been framed as a cooperative endeavor. We sink or swim together. I mean, look at the pandemic. The extent to which researchers and pharmaceutical companies and countries are pitted against each other to say, who can win to get the vaccine out? Everybody loses when it's a race. The most, not only nicest, happiest way to live, but the most productive way to live in terms of achievement is for there to be a collaborative enterprise where you succeed and I succeed too. We pull each other to success, and kids need to learn that by being placed in cooperative environments starting in their earliest years, including, I would even say, recreation, where play is not turned into a vicious battle, and certainly where we do away with garbage like spelling bees, awards assemblies, and so on.
So I had to turn on my camera here and ask a question. I couldn't resist, so my apologies. But it's so interesting because I'm going to try to weave this together with a couple of concepts. So much of being parenting is in some ways being a leader, right? In terms of not making it punitive, but I have done more for my leaders in my adult life who have shown me the behavior, and I've modeled the behavior to do things. Like, this is the way to be. It's not through punishment, it's through me seeing that you're willing to do anything that you're going to ask me to do. And in some ways, that's how I relate to my kids. At the same time, I see that in sports. And you brought up competition and this idea of sports and this idea of the collective, which could be a team being better together, yet competing against others. And so where is that line when it comes to competition, as you almost, I don't want to say taboo, but where is that there's an effort of a team and sportsman or sportsship. I don't want to use gender in that, say sportsmanship, but how does, because we see that in our children, all the sports, athletics builds leadership, growth, those kinds of things. So as a parent, I just am sitting here going, I got to chime in because these are things I'm dealing with personally, Alfie.
Yeah, that's another whole show. And for those, I don't want to just be, promoting my own books, and I'm not trying to sell them, go get them out of a library, but my first book that I wrote is on exactly this topic. It's called No Contest: The Case Against Competition. And there's a whole chapter about play in sports in which I was led ultimately to a very radical and still very unpopular position that I didn't have going in, which is that the problem is not how we have kids compete or how much or at what age. The problem is anytime we turn a game into a competition. And that's why I was so thrilled to discover books written by people decades before I came on the scene, showing how kids learn skills, get physically fit, fresh air. They are able to play with others in games that are not sports at all, but have been set up in ways where all of us have to be doing something to achieve the goal together. And yet in our culture, we're raised thinking that to have fun, you have to play a game, and to play a game, it has to be us against them. And if you begin with that premise, then you have to end up trying to introduce concepts like sportspersonship, which is basically a contrived way of saying, defeat them, destroy them, but don't break any rules. When you're playing a cooperative game, you don't need the concept of sportsmanship because everybody is working together to begin with. But as I say, that's it. People may find that too radical. If we're willing to move away from competition in the classroom, but we're not ready to give up the sports yet, that's okay for me. That's a big first step. But certainly as parents, we're put in the position of having to undo the damage that competition does on the playing field and in the schoolroom often by making it, and the last thing we would ever want to do is pit our children against each other if we have more than one. We would never want to use, phrases like, I don't know, who's the best little boy in the whole world, or let alone which of you can get in your pajamas fastest.
The fastest. Oh my goodness.
That's not innocuous stuff. That's training children subtly to look upon other people, including their own siblings, as people who are not potential allies and friends and loved ones and collaborators, but as potential rivals to be beaten. And as I say, everybody loses when it's turned into a race to win. But that's just one aspect that goes well beyond, I guess, what our principal topic here is today, dealing with.
We needed it though.
Well, thank you, and thank you for indulging me.
Of course.
That was a great question, Brent. And get Alfie's books. He's not promoting, to buy his books, and you don't have to, but you go to the library and look up Alfie Kohn. He has some really, great gems. As you spoke about Stacey Patton a little earlier, and one of the concepts that she has, and that what we do in the school system that it just kind of came to the forefront during this pandemic, which it had to shift, right, because of what we're doing, right? And it's the concept of, I got to be hard on you, especially in the African-American community, right? I got to be hard on you because they're going to be hard on you in the world. And it's like, well, if you know that people are going to be hard on children when they become adults, why not make this moment in time and this space and time in their life easier for them? Because
I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Because one of the things that you said is that children are going to do their own risk analysis anyway. We think that we're like preventing them or saving them for something, but everyone is kind of born with like flight or like these instincts. So we don't got to beat them down in an effort to lift them up.
That's right. Nobody ever became better at dealing with an oppressive, difficult, dysfunctional environment, a racist society, horrible individuals will come into contact with, or a really screwed up workplace. Nobody ever got better at dealing with unpleasantness by being made unhappy when he or she was a child. Exactly the reverse is true. When we support children with our unconditional support and love and care, that gives them the psychological tools they need, the wherewithal, the disposition to be able to deal with difficult situations. All of our kids in a tough environment in particular, especially in a tough neighborhood, but anywhere really, are going to need to be able to be independent thinkers who figure out, where do I need to compromise and where do I need to take a stand? How much risk can I take here? When do I need to obey even though it's unjust to save my butt? And when do I need to organize and speak out against a system that's unfair? For kids to be able to do that as they grow up, they need to have been raised in a system where we do more asking than telling. Or I'll summarize it this way. Kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not
Yeah.
by following directions. Spanking and a sort of an authoritarian, punitive approach is done typically for the best reasons by parents who love their babies and want to make sure they're safe. And in some neighborhoods, they're worried about them surviving to adulthood, never mind how successful they'll be in the workplace decades from now. They do it for the right reasons, but often do exactly the wrong thing and perpetuate a cycle of violence and self-hatred and power, while at the same time poorly equipping their children to make decisions and feel the autonomy necessary to be able to decide, how do I respond, by telling them to simply do what they're told. That's some of, Stacey Patton gets into some of this. I've been talking about some of this. A brand new study just this year by Wendy Grolnick at Clark University proved that a power-based, top-down, punitive approach to parenting is particularly destructive in dangerous neighborhoods. The exact opposite of what people use to rationalize perpetuating that do what I tell you or else approach.
Hey, I had a couple of questions that came in, and I know we're getting about 11, 12 minutes away from wrapping things up, and I thought this might be a good time to chime in. It strikes me that the two questions are connected in that they're about me as a parent. They are how do I deal with other parents who are perpetuating this norm, or how do I, in some ways, how do I help my kids deal with these norms? It's not so much about the relationship between the parent and the child. It's the environmental piece of it that some folks have got some questions about here. And so are there some tips and thoughts? I mean, do we all, I am not opposed to saying you should buy Alfie's book and say,
shameless plug.
Right, yeah, clearly, right. But in the moment when I'm sitting next to somebody at a basketball game, because my son decided he wanted to play basketball, how do we do that, right? They're like the conversations I have with my Black friends about race, and how do I tell my other friends about, like, how do we get past that? Where are those conversations that we can have?
Well, that depends on who you are, what your priorities are, what your tolerance for risk is, who your friends are, who your kids' teachers are. It depends on so many variables that it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer to that. Our kids will be dealing with other folks. We may try to do this, a working with home, only to send them to a doing to school, And frankly, I talk to teachers who ask the mirror image of that question. We try to create a working with classroom, and then we send the kids home to a doing to family. And, I don't want to criticize parents or teachers as a group. I love talking to them together so we can work, hand in hand to do what's best for kids. The conversations that we have with our friends will be different from the ones we have with our own parents or in-laws, or the people who glare at us on the street because, like your mom would say, you're entitled to ask why. You're a human being, it's a basic human right. And that didn't sit so well with some of the other people she knew. I see that for her as a teachable moment. And by the way, if I've said anything in this hour, a turn of phrase, anything that sounds to you like, oh, I could imagine using that, adapting it, turning it into my own words to convince somebody I know that spanking or spelling bees or grades or whatever aren't a good idea, please steal it, take it.
Absolutely.
It's yours. But there are ways we can turn it into a teachable moment by asking questions, or even by saying, if it's true, and I think you said before today, it's true for you, if you can say, I used to be here, I used to do this, And now I'm coming to rethink that. That is a powerful sort of personal testimony that can be persuasive to other people who haven't gotten quite as far as you have on this journey. As far as our children who will be in other environments, they will have to deal with conversations with other people. You know, right now I'm counting the minutes till I can get a vaccine. And so
Correct.
this is on my mind. And so that's a metaphor, really. We are immunizing our children so that when they are in environments where they may be infected by bad ideas that are traditional about
Yes.
education or parenting, we help them to build up an immunity so that even if they have to do some contest or there's some, you know, god-awful classroom management program or class dojo or PBIS or one of those other awful ways where we treat kids like pets at school, they can have a sense of perspective. Oh, I see what they're doing here. You know, if they can opt out, that's great. But even if they have to participate, they're not being socialized by it. They're able to say, this doesn't make sense. I can't wait to talk to mom when I get home about why the hell they're doing this to us kids and whether we can protest. So the conversations our kids will have with their teachers are different than the conversations we will have with other parents, and who may challenge us or may not. We always want to do it respectfully, but we want to invite them along and be forgiving, because most of us were raised and taught in exactly these kind of environments. And so we're all on a journey where we're beginning to say, I wonder if there's a better way. And we want to help other people to participate in that journey too.
So the other question that came in that I'm just, because the segue is perfect for this,
Yes.
is on sort of the multi-generational aspect of this, right? When you have grandchildren, and so I can use my own, corporal punishment was certainly something that I dealt with as a child.
Definitely dealt with it.
Right, you know, so raise your hand if you're out there.
Raise
right?
your hand
Like,
if you had corporal punishment, whoopings.
Right. So and now I have children, and I may choose not to use that. Then you open up sort of this multi-generational conversation with parents, grandparents, and I don't know if tips are the right word, is the right question to ask, but the dynamic of that multi-generational piece.
Talking to your grown children about how they raise theirs? I'm not sure who you're focused on here.
I think the question came in.
Very good question. Yeah.
If I'm the parent and my child, like let's just say AJ, and then there's a grandparent that they're used to corporal punishment.
And you're trying to the other way to the other. Yeah, because that's got to be dealt with very diplomatically, because if you're doing things different with your kid than they did to you, they may read that as a criticism of how they raised you.
Yes.
And they may not be wrong. So it's not just a matter of saying, no, I don't mean to call into question, you're whooping me. You do. And the question is, how do you do that in a way where you don't turn them off and make them defensive, where you acknowledge that I know you did what you did with me for the best possible reasons and out of love, but I have been exposed to some other things that are leading me to think there may be a different way. And I ask you to respect that around my child, your grandchild. And if you're interested in more, if you're open to the possibility of questioning the way, I know you did it because your parent did it to you and all your friends did it. I'm not saying you came up with this yourself, but I don't want to be pulled along on this like I'm just a boat in the current. I want to be more mindful and thoughtful about whether, especially given new research that's come out, there could be a better way. And then you sort of you test your way gingerly, gently, as to whether your parent is closing down or is going, what do you mean? Or why do you think that's true? And now a door has opened and you can say, read this, watch this video, or let's just continue to talk about it. But in the meantime, I'm moving more toward the work and with side. And because you've been there, you can anticipate many of the objections and challenges you're going to hear. Like,
Right.
you know, it's a rough world out there. Kids, in some places, had better learn to do what they're told or else. That's not the first time you've heard that. You've thought about it, and you can incorporate that objection and say, not only is it not necessary to use corporal punishment or timeouts or reward systems to get kids to survive and flourish, there may be much more powerful and effective ways of doing that, because you, mom, and I want the same thing for my kids. We want them to survive. We want them to flourish. We want them to be happy and healthy and successful. Our goals are aligned. I think I may have found some more effective methods.
Yes, I love that diplomacy.
We had one more direct question come in. One more, and then we'll wrap. It was about the idea of contract grading. Does that mean something, Alfie?
It's a variation of grades where kids are told basically in advance, here's what you have to do if you want to get an A. If you are going to do that much, that's okay. You'll get a B at the end. For me, it's one of many examples. Some of them are called standards-based grading that for me are massive exercises in missing the point. The problem is not the version of the grades that you use, the way you do it or set it up, or what you say in advance that the kid has a contract to do. The problem is grades themselves. And if you're a teacher and you're forced to turn in a grade for a kid at the end of the term, your job is to make grades as invisible as possible for as long as possible. And what I find that teachers in traditional school systems do, the ones who understand this research I mentioned about the inherently destructive effects of any kind of grading, is first, even if they have to turn in a grade at the end, they never put a grade on any individual paper, assignment, or anything else kids do. Just a comment or a conversation. Help kids forget about grades for as long as possible so they can focus on learning. And the second thing that many teachers in such traditional circumstances do is, even if I have to turn in a grade for my kids at the end, doesn't say I have to decide on them unilaterally. I let the kids pick their own grades. Maybe subject to my veto in the beginning, but at the end, I just let them do that. Don't sort of fuss around with these little minor repairs of different ways of grading. The grade is the problem, and it gets in the way of the learning. Just like don't try to praise kids for their effort instead of for their ability. Praise, which is just a verbal reward, is the problem. Don't use timeout rather than spanking. They're both punishments. Pull the camera back, look at the bigger picture, ask the radical questions, and move past all these variations of a traditional approach, none of which makes sense in terms of our long-term goals for our kids.
I also want to make sure that we get in a comment and question asked by Tanika Russell. So Tanika says she's never looked at rewards in this way, right? So she's amazed by how the advice you're giving about rewards. She has a toddler and tries to parent by rewards, like saying, great job, or you're so great. What would you suggest, Alfie, unconditional parenting style when it comes to a toddler or a very young child? We're talking about a 3-year-old here.
All of the examples I've given up until now, or almost all of them dealing with parenting, apply to toddlers as well as to older kids. So it's not like I'm going to say new stuff now. Could give different examples very quickly because I know we're running out of time. I would say, first, don't just look for a different script. What am I supposed to say? Look at the bigger question of unconditional versus conditional parenting. Praise, like good job, is not just incomplete. It is a perfect example of conditional parenting. That's not what you want to do, of course, but the message that the kid is getting is I've got to do a job, as if I'm in a workplace, that my parent regards as good in order to get that smile, high five, fist bump, hug, whatever. We need to get rid of all that stuff and make sure our children know that that love, that affection, those hugs are never dependent on a specific thing that they do. We love them for who they are, not for a behavior we approve of. Now, if we're thinking about the long-term goals, then we're going to have a different approach than if we're thinking of the short term. How do I get AJ to clean his damn room? How do I get my son to eat his vegetables? Look, what matters in the long run, whether long after the room's tidiness and the number of vegetables consumed are forgotten, are the way children grow, what kind of people they are, and what kind of relationships they have with us. We want to make sure that they knew that even when they screwed up, even when they didn't eat the lima beans, even when they didn't clean their rooms, we never stopped loving them. Punishments and rewards interfere with that perception of unconditional support. But now, very quickly, to be a little more concrete, when I have two children, I still vividly remember when they were very young, when they were toddlers, I tried not to manipulate them with good jobs. And that's what good job is. Praise is not encouragement. It is control. It is a judgment. And kids don't need to be judged in order to flourish. What can we do instead? First, we can shut the hell up and just watch. Second, we can describe what we see. When my daughter Abigail made it up the stairs on her own steam for the first time, she turned around and looked at me, and I was there. I didn't say, "Good climbing. You're such a good stair climber. I really like the way." Why would I steal her pleasure by telling her how to think about this? What I said to her then, I remember, was, "You did it." In other words, I noticed. Now you can form your own judgment about whether you're proud of this. I'm there for you. You got any questions? You need any help? But I'm not going to tell you how to feel about it. So from now on, every time you do something, you have to look to me. Was that good? Is that good? Are you proud of me now? We want kids, especially, by the way, this is gendered. I really don't want my daughter to grow into the kind of woman who needs a pat on the head from a man in a workplace or elsewhere. And that's exactly what praise will tend to instill. And the last thing we can do with our kids, including little toddlers, is ask them questions. When Abby drew an animal she loved drawing as a little kid, I would say, "Hey, you put toes on that horse this time. I don't think you had toes last week. How'd you figure out how to make those?" And I didn't know the answer to that. The best questions we ask as parents are the ones we don't already know the answer to. Otherwise, it's a manipulative game. You know, a response like that, "I see toes, how'd you draw toes?" pulls her into the drawing, helps her to be reflective about what she's doing. Just as if she gave half of her brownie to her friend Aditola, you know, I would say, "I know you love brownies. How come you decided to share it with her?" I don't know the answer to that. That helps her reflect on the kind of person she wants to be. When I judge her by giving her a verbal doggy biscuit for sharing or drawing well, I ruin all that. Now she's not intrinsically motivated to share or draw, and she's not as much of an independent person. She's more dependent on the powerful person to give her praise. So all this stuff makes perfect sense with toddlers, just as it does with older kids. But it's not just about ask questions instead of judging. It's about the broader questions of what are our long-term goals, what kind of relationship we want to have with our kids.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alfie, for your great words and your wisdom. As we said at the top of the show, parenting can be a challenge, and as we like to say in my household, parenting is a revolutionary act. It is radical. And some of the concepts that Mr. Alfie has shared with us have been probably radical to you. It's probably shifted your whole idea of what it means to be a parent, even when it comes to complimenting. So I want to close out with a few thoughts that COVID has taught us, or what parenting in a pandemic has taught us. It has taught us patience with juggling school, full-time jobs, managing households, while also not trying to catch a potentially deadly disease and die, it has definitely cultivated a new level of patience, especially if you're working and your kids are making noise or flipping, or in AJ's case, playing Legos or yelling at people on Fortnite. You just got to be patient. It also has taught us innovation, and we don't want to ruin our children's innovation, as Mr. Alfie has suggested, by adding a value to the things that they do. We want to help them to learn new ways to do math, help them to learn a way to do new apps. And, you know, AJ says all the time he wants to work on how to create a vaccine for COVID, right? As Mr. Alfie mentioned about immunizations, and not racing to see who can do it first as a competition, but his pure heart was, hey, I really want to help people so people can stop dying. It also taught us resilience with death, sickness, false information, constant changes, wear a mask, not wear a mask, do this, do that, virtual school, homeschool, all of that. It taught us resilience, and it taught us understanding. It taught us how to understand our child's education better. Maybe you were a factory worker and you were forced to be a fourth grade teacher, or you worked in higher ed like me, and I was forced to be a fifth grade teacher. It's not my ministry, nor would not recommend. But it taught us understanding. Understand that your child is not always wrong. You understood that the teacher is not always right. You understand what your child needs to succeed is things that we learn. And I want to touch on a key point that Alfie wrote in the book about just understanding your child and just the way we shift ourselves. There was a point in the book where sometimes we as parents, we say, you better eat this food, or if you don't eat right now, you're not going to eat later. And one of the things that Alfie shared was that when a kid gets hungry, they will eat. If there's food in the pantry, food in the refrigerator, you know, they will eat, as just long as you as the parent have it available. Another thing that we learned during this pandemic is family time is the best time. The pandemic slowed us down, where we could take time, and we understood that family was important, and we were able to see that at the forefront. And lastly, discipline. And what I definitely learned is talking it out is better than spanking it out. So again, it was a pleasure having you on the show, Mr. Kohn. Thank you, Miss Mary Jo, for thinking of me with the UM-Flint Alumni Association, as well as Brent. I appreciate you so much. It's always go blue, and shout out to Flint.